My name is Kletus and I'm a firefighter. I wasn't always one, though. Back in Nebraska, where I grew up, firefighting wasn't exactly what you'd call a booming career choice. But I wanted to do something that mattered, something bigger than myself. That's how I ended up here in Los Angeles, California, battling wildfires with a ground crew. It's not what most people think of when they hear firefighter. We're not sitting in a big red truck waiting for a call. No, we're out in the thick of it, hiking through dense forest, breathing in smoke and cutting fire breaks to keep the flames from devouring everything in their path. The job is tough, but it's worth it. I've always loved the outdoors, the way it makes you feel so small and alive at the same time. But this job, it's different. It's not just the fires that make your skin crawl. There are other things out there in the woods, things I wasn't trained to deal with. On my first day, the captain sat us down and went over the rules. Most of them were standard safety procedures. Wear your gear, stay hydrated, stick with your team. But then he got to the ones that made my stomach turn. "Listen up," he said, his voice like gravel. "We've got a few rules you won't find in any manual. Break these and you're putting yourself and your team in danger. Got it?" We nodded, though the tension in the room was thick. He continued. "Rule number 1, never under any circumstances take off your helmet when you're out in the woods at night." At first I thought it was about safety, protection from falling debris or embers. But the captain wasn't done. "You might hear things out there," he said, locking eyes with each of us. "Voices, whispers, maybe even someone calling your name. Don't listen. Keep your helmet on, and don't go looking for whoever's calling. It's not who you think it is." The room went dead silent. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but before I could ask what he meant, he moved on. "Rule number 2, if you see something flying overhead, don't look up. Keep your eyes on the ground and keep moving." Flying? I wanted to laugh, but the captain's tone made it clear this wasn't a joke. "Trust me," he said, "you don't want to know what's out there." Rule number 3, if you hear screams, no matter how human they sound, stay with your crew. That one got under my skin. I'd heard stories about foxes or mountain lions screaming like people in pain, but the way he said it made me think it wasn't just animals he was talking about. Rule number 4, when the fire dies down and you see shadows moving where they shouldn't, don't acknowledge them. Just do your job and leave. "What happens if you don't follow these rules?" I finally asked, my voice coming out weaker than I'd hoped. The captain stared at me for a long moment before answering. "You won't make it to the end of the season." My first few shifts were uneventful. The crew was tight-knit and hard-working, and I quickly found my place among them. The work was brutal, carrying heavy gear through miles of forest, cutting trees and digging trenches, but I liked it. At night we'd sit around a small campfire, trading stories and laughing about the day's close calls. But as the weeks went on, I started noticing things. One night we were deep in the woods, trying to control a blaze that had crept dangerously close to a small town. The fire had finally died down, leaving behind an eerie silence. As we packed up our tools, I saw something in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" I asked one of my crewmates, a guy named Mike. "See what?" he said, not even looking up from his pack. I didn't press the issue. Later that same night I heard it, a scream. It was high-pitched and desperate, like a woman in pain. Every hair on my body stood on end. "That's just a fox," Mike said casually, but he didn't sound convinced. We didn't sleep much that night. A few days later, we were working a shift in another part of the forest when I made my first real mistake. It was past midnight, and the only light came from our headlamps and the faint glow of the embers we were dousing. I was clearing some debris when I heard my name. "Kletus." It was faint, almost drowned out by the crackling of the fire, but unmistakable. "Kletus, over here." I froze. The voice was familiar. My brother's voice. He was back in Nebraska, 1,000 miles away. "Kletus, help me." My first instinct was to rip off my helmet and look around, but then I remembered rule number 1. My hands were shaking as I adjusted my helmet strap, making sure it was secure. The voice kept calling, growing louder and more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to focus on my work. Eventually, the voice faded, leaving behind an oppressive silence. When we got back to camp, I told Mike about it. "Yeah, it happens," he said, his face grim. "The woods mess with your head if you let them. Stick to the rules, and you'll be fine." I nodded, but I wasn't so sure. That night, as I lay in my tent, I thought about the captain's warning. I didn't know what I'd signed up for when I came to California, but it was becoming clear that this job was about more than just fighting fires. Something was out there in the woods watching us, waiting for us to slip up, and I wasn't about to give it the chance. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, once a place I loved, had turned into something alien, something alive in a way it shouldn't have been. But I wasn't about to let it get the better of me. I'd come here to fight fires, and no whispers in the dark or moving shadows were going to scare me off. The next few days were busy. A massive blaze had broken out in a remote section of the forest, and we were sent in to keep it from spreading to a nearby residential area. We drove deep into the woods, our headlights slicing through the darkness. The fire was relentless. Flames licked at the trees, casting long, distorted shadows. It was beautiful in a way, terrifying, but beautiful. We worked through the night, digging trenches and spraying water to control the burn. It was around 2 a.m. when things started to go wrong. We'd just finished clearing a section of trees when I heard a rustling sound behind me. At first I thought it was one of the crew, but when I turned around there was no one there. "Kletus, you good?" Mike called out from a few feet away. "Yeah," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Thought I heard something." "Probably just a coyote," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. I nodded and got back to work, but the feeling of unease lingered. An hour later, we were moving to a new location when I spotted something in the distance. It was tall, easily 8 or 9 feet, and covered in dark, matted fur. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, weaving between the trees. "Hey, Mike," I whispered, nudging him. "What?" I pointed toward the figure, but by the time he looked, it was gone. "Don't mess with me, man," he said, shaking his head. "I'm not," I insisted. "I saw something. It was huge." Mike frowned but didn't say anything. As the night wore on, the sightings became more frequent. I wasn't the only one seeing things now. Other members of the crew started murmuring about shadows that moved when they shouldn't, glowing eyes in the distance, and strange howls that didn't sound like any animal we knew. And then there were the screams. They started out faint, almost easy to ignore, but as the hours passed, they grew louder, more frantic. I clung to rule number 3 with everything I had, refusing to let myself be lured away from the crew. "Just foxes," I muttered under my breath, over and over again. Just foxes. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. At one point, we stopped for a break. The fire was under control for now, and we all gathered around the truck, sipping water and trying to catch our breath. That's when we heard it. A loud flapping sound, like massive wings cutting through the air. It was close. Too close. "Eyes down!" the captain barked. We all froze, staring at the ground like our lives depended on it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The flapping grew louder, followed by a strange, guttural screech. Whatever it was circling above us. The air felt heavy, almost electric, like the whole forest was holding its breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound disappeared. We stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity before the captain finally gave the all-clear. "What the hell was that?" I whispered to Mike as we got back to work. "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to," he muttered. By the time dawn broke, we were exhausted but alive. The fire was out and we'd done our job. As we packed up, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the morning light. For a brief moment, I thought it might step forward, but then it turned and disappeared into the trees. "Kletus, you coming?" the captain called out, snapping me out of my trance. "Yeah," I said, quickly throwing my gear into the truck. As we drove back to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there in the woods wasn't done with us yet. The next few nights were quiet. Too quiet. The crew and I fought smaller fires, but there were no more flying shadows or screams. Even the forest animals seemed to have vanished. At first, I told myself it was a good thing. No strange sounds, no eerie figures watching from the tree line. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. The woods felt tense, like something was waiting. We were stationed in a particularly remote area one night, cutting fire breaks around a ridge where the flames were creeping dangerously close to a small cluster of cabins. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the charred landscape. The captain split us into pairs to cover more ground. Mike and I were assigned to a section near the base of the ridge. As we worked, the silence pressed down on us like a physical weight. "Ever think about heading back to Nebraska?" Mike asked, breaking the tension. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I like it here. It feels, important, you know?" Mike nodded, but before he could respond, a sound cut through the night. A low, guttural growl. We both froze, our tools clutched tightly in our hands. "You heard that, right?" I whispered. "Yeah," Mike said, his voice barely audible. The growl came again, louder this time and closer. It didn't sound like a bear or a mountain lion. It sounded wrong, like it came from something that didn't belong in the woods. "Stick to the rules," Mike said, his eyes darting around. "Helmet on, eyes down. Don't wander off." We stayed close, our backs to the fire line, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. That's when we saw it. A pair of glowing amber eyes stared back at us from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and they didn't blink. The creature let out a sharp clicking noise that sent chills down my spine. "Don't look directly at it," Mike hissed. "Just back away, slowly." We moved carefully, never turning our backs on the thing. It didn't follow us, but it didn't retreat either. It just stood there, watching. When we regrouped with the rest of the crew, we didn't mention what we'd seen. The captain gave us a knowing look, but didn't press for details. "Sometimes the woods show you things," he said cryptically. "Things you're better off not understanding." The following night, we were called to a different section of the forest. A blaze had reignited near a riverbed, and we needed to contain it before it spread uphill. The terrain was rough, and the smoke made it hard to see, but we pushed on. As we worked, I started to notice strange patterns in the ash and soot, circles and symbols that looked almost deliberate. I pointed them out to Mike, but he just shrugged. "Probably just the way the fire burned," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. The symbols grew more intricate as we moved deeper into the burned area. Some of them looked freshly drawn, as if someone, or something, had been here recently. Around midnight, the wind picked up, carrying with it a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Foxes," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't foxes. The wailing turned into whispers, dozens of voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The sound grew louder and louder until it felt like my head might split open. "Stay together," the captain shouted over the noise. We huddled close, our eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We decided to call it a night, retreating to a nearby clearing to set up camp. As we sat around the fire, the captain finally addressed the elephant in the room. "This job isn't just about fighting fires," he said, his voice low. "It's about protecting something bigger. The forest isn't just trees and animals. It's alive in ways most people can't understand." "What about the things we've been seeing?" I asked. "They're the Watchers," he said. "They've been here long before us, and they'll be here long after. They don't like us being here, but as long as we follow the rules, they'll let us do our job." That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the captain's words in my head, wondering what he meant by protecting something bigger. I still didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. The forest was watching, and it was only a matter of time before it decided what to do with us. The next fire we faced was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It started as a small blaze, contained to a dry ravine, but by the time we arrived, it had grown into a roaring inferno, Flames stretched high into the sky, and the heat was so intense it felt like the air itself was burning. We didn't have a choice. We had to go in. The fire was creeping toward a nearby campground where families were staying. If we didn't act fast, it would be a tragedy. The team moved quickly, setting up containment lines and attacking the fire head-on. The roaring flames and smoke made communication nearly impossible, so we relied on hand signals and the trust we'd built in each other. The captain paired me with Mike again, and we were sent to clear debris near a dense patch of forest. The fire hadn't reached it yet, but it was only a matter of time. As we worked, the forest seemed to come alive around us. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, darting between the trees. The ground felt unsteady, like the earth itself was shifting beneath my feet. And then I heard it, the flapping of wings. "Kletus," Mike said, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "I know," I whispered. "Eyes down. Helmet on." We both crouched low, pretending to focus on our work as the sound grew louder. The flapping was accompanied by that same guttural screech we'd heard before. It was close. Too close. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something massive swoop down from the treetops. It was dark and feathered, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through the smoke. It circled us once before disappearing into the darkness. "Did you see it?" Mike asked once the sound had faded. "I saw it," I said, my hands shaking. "Let's just get this done and get out of here." We finished clearing the debris and started heading back to the truck when we heard a loud, guttural roar. This wasn't like the fox screams or the strange whispers. It was deep, primal, and filled with rage. We froze, scanning the area with our flashlights. And that's when we saw it. The creature stepped out from the tree line, its massive form illuminated by the firelight. It was covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes glowed amber. It was hunched over, but even then, it was easily 9 feet tall. Its hands, or claws, hung low, and its teeth gleamed as it let out another bone-chilling roar. "Bigfoot," Mike whispered, his voice filled with both awe and terror. The creature stared at us for a moment before taking a step forward. "Run!" I said, grabbing Mike's arm. We took off, sprinting through the forest as fast as we could. The creature didn't follow, but we didn't stop until we reached the truck. When we got back to the rest of the crew, we told the captain what we'd seen. "You're lucky it didn't decide to attack," he said. "They're territorial, but they're not usually aggressive. Must have been the fire that upset it." "What are they?" I asked. "Ancient," the captain said. "Older than the trees, older than the land itself. We don't mess with them, and they don't mess with us, usually." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the creature. It was terrifying, sure, but there was something almost sad about it. It wasn't just a monster. It was something more, something I didn't fully understand. As I lay in my tent, I thought about the rules. They weren't just about keeping us safe. They were about respecting the forest and everything in it, even the things that didn't make sense. The forest had its own rules, its own order, and we were just visitors. When morning came, we returned to the site to finish the job. The fire was mostly out, but the forest was still smoldering. As we worked, I noticed something strange. A series of large footprints leading away from the burn zone. They were impossibly large, and they headed deep into the untouched part of the forest. I didn't say anything to the crew. Some things, I figured, were better left unsaid. By the time we returned to camp, I was exhausted but oddly at peace. The forest was dangerous, yes, but it was also beautiful. It was alive in a way that I'd never fully appreciated before. And whatever else it was, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't done with it yet. The last night of the wildfire season came faster than I expected. It felt like just yesterday I was driving into the unknown, unsure of what lay ahead. Now, standing in the same woods that had once terrified me, I felt something different. A sense of belonging. That evening, the captain called us together for a final briefing. The fire we were headed to wasn't just any fire. It was the last uncontrolled blaze in our region. If we put this one out, the season would officially be over. "Stay sharp," the captain said. "This fire's got a mind of its own. Follow the rules and don't let your guard down. You've all done good work this season, but tonight's gonna be the real test." The fire was deep in the wilderness, far from any towns or roads. It had started in a remote canyon, feeding on the dry brush and old growth. By the time we arrived, it had already consumed hundreds of acres. The smoke was so thick it felt like the night had swallowed us whole. The air was heavy with ash, and the glow of the flames cast eerie shadows on the trees. Our team split into smaller crews, each assigned to a different section of the fire. Mike and I were sent to the far edge, tasked with creating a firebreak near a steep ridge. As we worked, the forest around us seemed to close in. The sounds of the fire were muted, replaced by an unsettling silence. And then the whispers started. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as they grew louder I realized they were words. They weren't in English or any language I recognized, but they had a strange rhythm, like a chant. Mike froze, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, gripping my tool tighter. We shone our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing there. "Keep working," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't look up. Don't stop." We followed the rules, our movements mechanical as we cleared the brush. The whispers grew louder, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. And then they stopped. A low growl rumbled through the forest. It wasn't like the Bigfoot's roar or the screeches we'd heard before. This was different, deeper, more guttural, and filled with malice. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and the air grew cold. The firelight dimmed, as if something was draining the energy from the flames. And then we saw it. It was a shadow, darker than the night itself, with eyes like burning coals. It moved like smoke, its form shifting and twisting as it crept closer. "Kletus," Mike whispered. "What do we do?" "Rule 4, I said, my voice barely audible. "Don't let it know you're afraid." I stood my ground, forcing myself to breathe slowly. The shadow loomed over us, its eyes locked on mine. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice steady. The shadow hissed, its form writhing as if in pain. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. When we returned to the truck, the rest of the crew was already there. "You saw it, didn't you?" the captain asked. I nodded. "You handled it well," he said. "Not everyone does." By the time the fire was out, dawn was breaking. The forest was quiet again, the air filled with the smell of damp ash and pine. As we packed up our gear, the captain pulled me aside. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Kletus," he said. "You're one of the best I've seen." "Thank you, sir," I said, feeling a swell of pride. Back at the station, the crew celebrated the end of the season with a barbecue. There was laughter, stories, and a sense of camaraderie that I hadn't felt in a long time. But as the night wore on, I found myself staring out at the dark forest beyond the station. I thought about the rules, the creatures we'd seen, and the whispers in the woods. I thought about the shadow and the way it had seemed to test me. The forest was a strange and dangerous place, but it was also alive in a way that I couldn't explain. And I knew deep down that I'd be back next season, because this was more than just a job. It was a calling.